Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 49.
A sacrifice zone is a place that's so polluted, it can never be cleaned up. So in a sense, the question of the book is, will these activists, will their hearts become sacrifice zone? Can they engage in dealing with these terrible things that are happening without being consumed by rage and anger and grief?
Climate change and environmental destruction are urgent issues, but the constant barrage of bad news can lead to outrage and despair. How can we stay informed and engaged without succumbing to negativity? I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and our guest today on the Outrage Overload podcast believes there's a way to navigate these challenges with courage and compassion.
Hello, folks. I'm Roger Gottlieb. I'm a professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Boston. My focus is on those things which really matter to human existence right now, principally right now, the environmental crisis, which threatens us all. And I'll be happy to talk about that in the way I've embodied that concern in my novel, The Sacrifice Zone.
Professor Gottlieb has dedicated his life to exploring the intersection of environmentalism, spirituality, and social justice. His unique perspective offers a path forward in these challenging times. Join us for a thought-provoking conversation on how to find courage and take action in the face of the environmental crisis right now. So I've been for a while trying to figure out how to bring a conversation about environment into the show. We've talked a lot about various social sciences, political polarization, things like that. And so this will be a little new to me, so we'll see how I do here. But to me, it feels like climate change and just the environmental crisis in general should theoretically be a place that could bring people together. But in this world we're in, everything is so politicized that it's in practice not what's happening. So maybe I can ask you to talk about that a little bit, and then I also curious to have you sort of talk about how you ended up writing a novel to I think in a role of trying to create awareness of this problem, right? And how you ended up sort of deciding that a novel was the way to do it.
Right. Okay. Well, you can start with the absolute worst environmental problems, which you think, well, is that climate change? Is it the fact that there in 20 years there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish? Is it the fact that newborn babies have 100 toxic chemicals in their body? No, the greatest environmental threats are avoidance and denial, because it's such a huge problem, more complicated and more threatening than any problem human beings have ever faced in the past, that people just cannot take it in. It's scary. It threatens very common things. I mean, you think about something like gay marriage. Okay, you like it, you don't like it, but so these people will get married. They'll get divorced and stop having sex like heterosexual couples. The people who sell stuff to weddings will make a lot of money. What does it threaten? Or think of the civil rights movement. Let these people register to vote. Well, that's dangerous, and people were murdered because they tried to do it, but it's not complicated. Any 10-year-old can understand, yeah, they're not allowed to vote, let them vote. But the environmental crisis in all its many manifestations threatens so much of our daily lives, how we drive, how we eat, how we consume, how we travel or don't travel. It's threatening on such fundamental ways. It's taking away things of great value that we cherish. The whole structure of nature spirituality, which for thousands of years have given people a sense of peace, of enjoyment, of gratitude, of contentment, of being connected to something larger. Now, a lot of times, what are you connected to? A graveyard. Go look at the coral reefs bleaching white. Go look at the forest cut down. Go look at the the mountaintops decimated by mountaintop removal. All these things are up for grabs. It's too much to take. And as well, I'm sure some of your listeners, I have dealt with it in a close family relationship, are familiar with addiction. Every addict knows they're an addict. Every addict knows that they shouldn't be doing this, that the future is no good. But for whatever reason, and it changes from person to person, they can't stop. And we are addicted to fossil fuels, high consumption, traveling, production of plastic, all these kinds of things. And it terrifies us to stop. So we just dig in and do more of it, just like any addict.
Well, and it seems like there's a problem with the cause and effect too, right? Because, partially there's like a delay and we're not good at remembering things if it didn't happen pretty close together. But then you of course also can kind of you have a lot of people rationalizing out as well that well that's not really happening because it's really something else.
Right?
Um,
Yeah.
Whereas some of these other things that are out there are kind of in our face. Like, now you're seeing things like a lot of changes in number of storms and severity of storms and things like that. But people go, well, that's just a cycle. That just was going to
Right.
happen anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's another challenge we face but that's an interesting perspective. I like the denial idea of that because, and the addiction relationship are tying that to a kind of idea about what's going on with addiction. Because, yeah, I think that's another reason why I mean, that's a good reason why we do all that rationalization, I guess.
Right. Well, it's also in what I call, I actually invented this phrase, neurological colonization, which is what our cell phones and the internet and computers do to us. We are having a considerably diminished ability to think critically, to think slowly, to take our time giving an opinion. And something like the environmental crisis demands a longer view. That's a cliche that the Native Americans used to say, 7 generations. You're going to make a change? Ask how it would affect 7 generations down. And what do we think about? Maybe next week, next month, if we're really ambitious, we think about 2 years from now, but 100 years from now, 120 years from now? No, we don't. Now, as to the ultimate cause, well, you can talk about the rise of modern science. You can talk about capitalism, which thrives on unending expansion and turns all environmental consequences into externalities, right? You buy a pair of sneakers, you don't pay for the environmental consequences, you just pay for the sneakers. And so the environmental consequences are paid for by somebody else. So capitalists, they're supposed to hate socialism. They love socialism. They prize it above all things because they're socializing in a socialistic kind of way the environmental costs of the incredible destructive policies that they take. But so the question, I mean, in terms of the theme of your podcast is once you get past the denial and avoidance, are you going to be stuck endlessly in a loop of hatred and rage and unending grief and inability to enjoy what's left, an inability to feel gratitude that this incredible, fantastic miracle of life was ever here on this planet? And so the theme of the book is it's sort of layers within layers is what would an environmental saint look like now? And how would her activity, her activism, her commitment to saving what can be saved, protecting what can be protected, both human beings and non-human forms of life, what would that look like? So one of the characters, Sarah, is that kind of a person. And she's met by Daniel, who's 10 years older, a college professor who came late to this. And he's very active, but he's bitter and he's rageful and he hates and she is this, she's smiling and sometimes she's crying, but when she cries, and then she stops crying. And she knows what it is to get angry when a guy comes to her for help about mountaintop removal, where it's a form of coal mining. If people don't know, where you don't dig a hole in the earth, you just cut the top off a mountain. Leads to all kinds of toxic material in the streams. When Donald Trump became president, he uh, threw out the regulations on what they could put in the streams in mountaintop removal. Terrible for the communities. So what is it like to be able to do that? And then the sub theme, the secondary theme, is a woman whose sister is a heroin addict and her addiction destroys this woman's family. And she can't take it. She's consumed with trying to help her sister and she can't. And anybody who's ever lived with a heroin addict, a fentanyl addict, a serious alcoholic knows it's almost impossible to help somebody. So to retreat from that, she turns to Buddhist meditation and retreats more and more and ends up a distinguished teacher of Buddhism in America and begins to see, she tries to have a kind of breakdown in her late 40s. She begins to see that she became a Buddhist in this way only at the expense of turning off every feeling that she possibly had. The title of the book is The Sacrifice Zone, which is a term of art from environmental studies. A sacrifice zone is a place that's so polluted it can never be cleaned up. So in a sense, the question of the book is, will these activists, will their hearts become sacrifice zone? And this woman who becomes a Buddhist teacher, will her heart become a sacrifice zone? Or is there some other way? Not denial, not avoidance, not selfishness, but fully engaged in, for the heroin addict's sister to be able to love her sister. Even if she's not curing her, just bring her a gallon of ice cream and some roses. And for the activists, can they engage in dealing with these terrible things that are happening without being consumed by rage and anger and grief? That's what goes on.
Well, yeah, and that has a lot of similarities to this kind of depolarization, bridge building sort of work regarding, the sort of helplessness you can feel in trying to bridge these divides and just,
Right.
deal with polarization. And I think the environment is a bigger one. It's even harder to, like you said at the beginning,
Yeah.
it's such a big problem and it's such a complex thing, and it's so sort of it's just all encompassing.
Well,
And
it becomes like a club, right? There's the people who believe in global warming and the people who don't, the people who are vegetarians and the people who aren't. And if somebody outside your club says something, you don't examine for whether or not it's true or false. You just, somebody outside my club said it, right? So here I am, what the people on the opposing side would call a member of the elite. If I'm such an elitist, why don't I make a lot more money? That's my question, you know.
you didn't get the
But
check this week.
right, no, they skipped over me. So here I am, a college professor with a PhD who writes books, who believes in the environment, who's a socialist, who's a feminist, who's an environmentalist. How could anything I say be possibly connecting to them? And so it's very hard to make that connection. I wish there were more places where they tried it. I know many, many, many years ago, they took 6 women in Boston, 3 staunch people for women's reproductive rights, and 3 people who were sort of pro-life, and they had them come together once a month and talk. And they did that for 6 or 8 months. Nobody changed each other's minds, but they heard each other's stories. They saw the life experience behind those beliefs, and they became not the closest of friends, but they became, they could talk, they could think, they could listen. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things. There's an organization in Israel called Arava, which is composed of Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians, and they work in environmental issues. And together, Israelis and Palestinians working together. Who could have think it would be possible? Well, they say to the people around them, look, you're going to fight over the land. What makes you think in 50 years this land will be habitable? Because maybe with, if it gets really hot out there in the Mediterranean, it gets hot already, but it gets really hot, it gets dry, they're finished. People have been praying for rain there for 2,500 years. It's a standard Jewish prayer. Changes every season, whether you pray for rain or just dew. In the summer, in the winter, you pray for rain. In the summer, you pray for dew. So it is possible to forge that way. There's a book on Yellowstone which looks at the 3 different sort of social groups around Yellowstone, including sort of the leftist hippies who move in to take care, to save the bison, and the local ranchers who are, kind of like cattle people, and the very rich people from California, near California, and they come in and buy a property. And they disagree about many things, but in the last chapter, it talks about something they agreed on, which was preserving a certain open area not to be developed. And so they found something to work on. They're not going to work on the other things together. The ranchers are not going to become vegetarians. They're not going to talk about animal rights or identify with the pain that the cow feels when you cut its throat. But on something was found. In order to find that, you got to be able to talk to somebody. You got to be able to turn down the outrage, to listen, because people, the extremists on the other side, they're finished. They're gone. But what about all the people more or less in the middle who aren't sure, who think maybe Gottlieb's got something? That's me, Gottlieb. Maybe Gottlieb's got something right, but maybe this guy over here from the oil company, maybe he's also got something. So they're thinking back and forth. So if they hear my critical rage at them, what are they going to do? They're not going to listen to anything I say. But if I manage to, I think Martin Luther King really did this very, very well. He aroused a lot of antagonism, but he didn't arouse any unnecessary antagonism, because he talked about love, talked about respect, he talked about helping white people get back onto a moral track. He didn't talk about you disgusting honkies and all this kind of stuff. He didn't do that because that was unnecessary antagonism. And that's what I try to do in my writings. That's what I try to do in my lectures and in my life. Am I always successful? No. Sometimes I just give into the rage because I want to kill him. But that's, normal. I'm a normal human being in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah. We all have those days.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Gottlieb, why, even the polarization issue gets talked about some. I mean, you still have a lot of divisive news channels and so on, but you see some people talking about it. It seems like I've been, my lifetime of media, climate change has been around and been talked
Right.
about here and there, but it just seems like it doesn't have, and it doesn't just have the awareness and attention that you'd think it would have. And maybe that some of that is that 20 years or 30 years is seems like a long time to a person, but it's such a
Right.
tiny short amount of time in Earth's
Yeah.
timeline, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to see that far down the pike. And the people who are, the cliche by now, the people who are most affected have the least voice in society. When you had terrible floods in New Orleans, the predominantly black population, who cares, right? Whereas in Salisbury Beach, Massachusetts, where they put $3 million to bring in sand to protect beach homes that was going to work for 3 years, the next day it was washed out by a storm. But they've got money. They can put those, they can keep piling the sand in because there's $1.5 billion worth of real estate on that beach. So it's the inequality of it. And you must remember that the unbelievable amount of vested wealth in fossil fuels. Exxon has known about this stuff for almost 40 years. It's been clear they're being sued because the evidence has come out. They knew about it. They told their facilities on the coast to get stronger and higher because the sea was going to rise. They knew about this. They hired a public relations firm to cast doubt on it. The same public relations firm that was hired to cast doubt on the relation between cigarettes and cancer. Same firm. Imagine what it's like to work for those guys. So there's an enormous industry keeping this the way it is. And not surprisingly, fascist tendencies, whether in Russia, in Iran, in China, in the United States, in Hungary, all side with the fossil fuel folks. They all go together and they all make it illegal to oppose, increase penalties on people who resist or who demonstrate, all this kind of thing. So the forces of vested social power that don't care, I mean, Lenin said the last capitalist will sell you the rope that you hang him with, and the last fossil fuel executive will sell you the last gallon of gas that destroys the planet. They really can't stop. And they are the addicts. It's not just us with our pickup trucks and our hamburgers. They are addicted to the wealth, the power, the sense of self-importance. There's something, the marriage of the personal identity, the person with the work, that is so crucial to them. Do they want to destroy the planet? No. They want to be important people. A vice president of Exxon making $800,000 a year, dressing in a beautiful suit. That's really something. And so it's very hard to oppose. There are forces. I mean, one of my areas of expertise is religious environmentalism. And thank God, most religious groups have taken some serious stands, have been involved in some serious activities. You have the current Pope who talked about us turning the world into an immense pile of filth. You have the head of the World Council of Churches saying that the United States should lower its per capita CO2 emissions to that of the poorest countries in the world. Imagine what that would be like. Um, you have, groups demonstrating here, trying to save land there. You have religious people doing it for explicitly religious reasons. You have people doing civil disobedience on that. I took part in some of that ones. So on every continent, in every country, there are environmentalists who are trying to do something. Are we winning? I wouldn't say so. But, the nice thing about ignorance is that you can't be sure how terrible the future is going to be.
Well, so yeah, so I guess I do want to definitely try to see if we can steer towards some hope and action in this. Because I feel like there's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma here for the international players, right? It's like if Iran sort of makes a change, they're not going to be competitive. They
Right.
lose a
Yep.
competitive advantage. Who's going to start? Like who's going to
That's right.
give first? And that create. But so as an individual, what there's just a tremendous hopelessness in this case. Like you just feel like, well, there's nothing I can do. I'm just going to live my life, and it's somebody else's problem.
Right.
And
Well, I think that, people, when I give public talks from time to time, people say, well, Professor Gottlieb, offer us some hope. And I say, sorry, I'm not here to offer hope. Rather, I'm here to offer courage. And I think that if you look back in history, I wrote one of my first books on this was called The Spirituality of Resistance, which said that the way we face, as spiritual beings, the way we face reality instead of hiding from it is by resisting evil. And one of my classic examples, there are people who fought back in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust. A handful of Jews resisting the might of the Nazis, Jews with very little military training, practically no weapons. And they managed to survive longer than Czechoslovakia or Poland. Uh, but they fought because that was what you do. Try it another way. Imagine, God forbid, that your beloved mother is really sick. She's in the hospital. The nurse says you better get her affairs in order. Not much hope, maybe, but not much hope. Are you going to spend all your time thinking about, oh, the future, oh, hope, oh, the future, or are you going to sit with her in the hospital, hold her hand, sing to her, kiss her, tell her how much you love her? That's what you want to do with most of your energy. You may go out in the corridor and cry your eyes out because mom's dying, but you also want to show her as much love as you can today, whatever the future will be. Now, what's a bigger cliche than Mother Earth, right? So we can do that today. And Mother Earth includes people. My fundamental metaphysical position is life is good. Life is a miracle. And so life is tremendously worthwhile. My life and the frog's life and the ant's life and the virus's life, it's all a miracle. So how can I show in my own tiny, aren't zero enough zeros after the decimal point to show how small what I can do is, but I can still do something. I can still, and it matters what I do. If 10 million children are being sexually abused, you wouldn't want to say, well, what's one more? I'll go sexually abuse a child. That would be utterly horrible. But it's only 1 out of 10 million. Yeah, but it's you who's the one who's doing it. So we can do this in our daily life, but also the most important thing is to, as an individual, join up with other individuals, create a movement, not create, sustain a movement with money, with time, with effort. If you can, go get arrested blocking a coal train. That'd be great. Stand up at a church, stand up at a community meeting, talk in your university, your school, your community, wherever, talk at your Thanksgiving Day dinner with your family. Express what you feel as clearly, as respectfully, as kindly, and as clearly as possible. That's all we can do. But we do it in groups, in groups, in groups. And there are plenty of groups in this country to join of every, from some particular river to animals as a whole and everything in between. There's always something one can do. And you feel just what you feel better because if you feel like I can't do anything, then yes, you're confirming in your own mind your powerlessness, which is a sad thing. But if you fight back, I don't mean violently, but if you struggle back, if you resist, then that sense of powerlessness fades, even if you don't win. I mean, the people in the Warsaw Ghetto, they didn't expect to defeat the German army, but they fought back. They fought back, and we can fight back. And there are all sorts of stories. I mean, there's something, called the Goldman Environmental Prize. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's a quite wealthy amount of money that's devoted to giving to environmental activists. And they give, I think, 8 or 10 every year, the Goldman Environmental Prize. And you just go to that website, and you read what these people have done. And they're great people in the United States. They're great people in other countries where you take your life in your hand. I mean, the 50 environmental journalists are murdered every year for telling the truth about what's going on. So people in Africa and China and Latin America, all over the world. And say, these folks are doing it. These folks, some of them are taking their lives in their hands. Well, what's some small thing I can do, which then become maybe a slightly bigger thing? And then I won't have to feel so crushed by the weight of reality. Then I can join with reality instead of hiding from it. I can join with reality as I resist it. And that's the picture I'm trying to paint in the novel, The Sacrifice Zone.
Awesome. Well, yeah, that sounds like the way to go. I mean, it's very similar to the message we talk about with polarization here is that you do have agency. There are things you can do. We're still
Yeah,
only one person, but there we are part of a movement.
that's right. Very good. Yes, absolutely.
Well, Professor Gottlieb, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.